They called it the empire on which the sun never set, but behind the grandeur and power was a legacy of blood, exploitation, and suffering. From stolen riches to human lives traded like currency, the British Empire's rise was anything but noble. This is the dark truth they don't teach in history books. For nearly 4 centuries, the British Empire stretched across the world, its power casting a long and imposing shadow over history. At its height, it was the largest empire the world had ever seen, governing nearly a quarter of the planet's land and people. From the grand halls of London to the vast plantations of the Caribbean, from the towering gates of Delhi to the gold mines of Africa, British influence was everywhere. The empire's legacy is often painted in shades of civilization, trade and progress, railways, education, governance. But beneath this polished narrative lies a darker truth. The empire did not rise by mere diplomacy or enterprise. It was built on violence, greed, and the relentless exploitation of millions. It was an empire of conquest, where economic gain was prized above human life, where resistance was crushed with an iron fist, and where entire cultures were reshaped, often against their will. Today we unravel the story of the British Empire, not through the lens of its rulers, but through the eyes of those who lived under its rule. This is a story of power and oppression, of profit and pain. It began with ships. Sleek wooden vessels bearing the English flag set sail from the ports of London and Bristol, their cargo holds filled with weapons and ambitions. In the late 16th century, England, a rising naval power, began carving out its place in the world. The first targets were coastal territories in North America and the Caribbean. In 1607, the British established Jamestown, their first permanent colony in what would become the United States. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean soon followed, worked by enslaved Africans forcibly taken from their homeland. The transatlantic slave trade became the backbone of British wealth. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were captured, shackled, and transported across the ocean in horrific conditions. Many perished before reaching the shores of the Americas, their bodies thrown into the sea. Those who survived faced a lifetime of brutality. But Britain's ambitions did not stop at the Atlantic. The East India Company, founded in 1600, began its slow but ruthless domination of the Indian subcontinent. What started as a trading venture quickly turned into military conquest. By the 18th century, British forces were toppling Indian rulers, using diplomacy when possible, but more often using cannons and bayonets. By the 19th century, the British Empire had become an unstoppable force. In Africa, explorers and soldiers pushed deeper into the continent, claiming land, extracting resources, and enforcing their rule. In India, the British tightened their grip, dismantling centuries-old kingdoms and replacing them with colonial bureaucracy. The year 1857 marked a turning point. Indian soldiers in the British Army, known as sepoys, rose up against their colonial masters in what would become known as the Indian Rebellion. The uprising was met with merciless retaliation. British troops executed entire villages, and rebels were blown apart by cannons as a warning to others. The rebellion failed, and in its aftermath, the British Crown formally took control of India, ushering in nearly a century of direct rule. Meanwhile, in Africa, the infamous Scramble for Africa was underway. European powers, led by Britain, divided the continent like pieces on a chessboard, with little regard for the people who lived there. Local resistance was crushed with superior weaponry. Entire communities were displaced. Resources, gold, rubber, diamonds, were extracted for British profit, while indigenous populations were left impoverished. To the British public, the empire was painted as a noble mission. Politicians and newspapers spoke of the white man's burden, the supposed duty to bring civilization to the so-called uncivilized world. They pointed to railways, schools, and legal systems as proof of progress. But what was left unsaid was the cost. Forced labor built those railways. Local traditions and governance were dismantled. Entire generations were denied self-rule. When resistance arose, the British responded with brute force. In Kenya, during the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s, colonial authorities imprisoned and tortured thousands. In India, when peaceful protesters gathered in Amritsar in 1919, British troops opened fire, killing hundreds in what became known as the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European nations were locked in fierce competition. Spain and Portugal had already claimed vast territories in the Americas. The Dutch controlled valuable trade routes in Asia. Britain, a rising naval power, was desperate for its share of the riches. Gold and silver from the New World filled Spanish treasuries. Spices from Indonesia made the Dutch fabulously wealthy. The British needed their own source of profit, and they found it in trade. The British East India Company, founded in 1600, was more than a trading enterprise. It was a private army with a license to conquer. With each passing decade, it tightened its grip on the Indian subcontinent, securing lucrative markets for cotton, silk, and spices. By the 18th century, India was not just a trading post, it was the crown jewel of British economic expansion. But there was another commodity, one that would shape the course of history: tea. Britain's obsession with tea fueled an insatiable demand. But there was a problem. The best tea came from China, a nation that had little interest in British goods. The answer? Opium. Grown in British-controlled India and smuggled into China, opium became a weapon of economic warfare. By the early 19th century, millions of Chinese people were addicted, and the British reaped the rewards. When China resisted, Britain responded with gunboats, triggering the Opium Wars. The British Empire had perfected a brutal equation: trade, profit, conquest.